RPGs are a genre that I've experienced, enjoyed, and have had some fond memories of, but I would never say in a million years that they were necessarily a favorite of mine. I loved Fallout 3 when I first played it, as that was the first real RPG I ever played, but it was really the only RPG game that I could think of offhand that I would consider to be one of my favorite games. But at the same time, RPGs have been such an enticing genre to me for years. The agency that you have in them is one of the highest draws it has, promising player choice to matter and the world bending around your avatar's decisions, as well as the allurement of making your own character beyond just a simple character creator screen. Picking your stats, choosing what to specialize in as well as what to fail in, and having to navigate all of the game's many quests and problems with your imperfect little character is genuinely so cool. All of these systems that for a long time were so enticing and so esoterically enjoyable finally seemed to coalesce into a seemingly impossible video game called Baldur's Gate 3. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that Baldur's Gate 3 sort of broke video game discourse entirely, at least for a little bit. It is an incredibly deep and mechanics-heavy CRPG that not only literally called back to the CRPG games of old with its name, but its systems were basically untouched, if not only slightly refined from that old design mentally to be ever so lightly palatable for today's gaming populace. It really had no right to do as well as it did, and yet despite all of this, the game exploded. You don't need me to explain how it won basically every award it was nominated for, and its Steam player numbers were among the consistently highest of any game released that year. It was a phenomenon. It arguably still is. It was through this hype that gave me the strength to cave in and really give an earnest and honest attempt to play a mechanically deep and fleshed out CRPG. To so many people, Baldur's Gate 3 is the perfect CRPG, one of the best, if not the best, ever made. The breadth of player agency is basically unparalleled, with one of the only comparisons I could even think of being Fallout New Vegas, which released 13 years prior. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game whose excellence is clear to me, and its ability to even exist as a video game is not only a staggering technical achievement, but basically a miracle. But it is a game I just cannot enjoy. At least not fully. See, playing through much of Baldur's Gate 3 as I did when I made my video on it made me realize that I loved half of it. Unfortunately, D&D combat is something that does not click with me in essentially any measurable metric. I just don't fuck with it at all. However, the depth of character building and the way that your decisions have a substantial impact on the game world is incredible, and sitting in dialogue trees and watching the ways that your character build can interact with the game via skill checks is more than 100% my jam. I love stretching the game's systems through my decisions and seeing how far I can push the game in any single direction. But these things in tandem with the combat unfortunately made me fall off of Baldur's Gate 3. And in my video talking about Baldur's Gate 3, I said that I wished that there was a way that I could play the game with the combat entirely removed, as it would essentially be my ideal CRPG. The systems in Baldur's Gate 3 spoke to me deeply, but not deep enough that I wanted to wade through the messy and knowable waters that were its combat. A game with the depth and breadth of Baldur's Gate 3 that fully leaned into its character building and dialogue options would essentially be the perfect game for me. But that would be impossible. It would essentially take a miracle. Esoteric Ed begins 5 days before the first ever election in the city of Norvik, a city that is essentially the last bastion for humanity, as most of them have been eradicated throughout history and the many wars that they have taken a part in. You have been tasked to uncover the reasoning and the culprit behind an explosion that occurred in a local tea shop, which has sparked political discussions of espionage, concerns for safety of the people of the city, the safety of the election in general, as well as potential infighting between the political factions of the city. This is your main mission throughout Esoteric Ebb, but there is also a slight catch. You're dead. Well, only for a little bit. You start the game awakening in the bottom of a morgue after having drowned in the water nearby, but totally unaware of how it is that you got to be in the water. You probably want to find out who did it. What starts as a pretty self-explanatory narrative doesn't take long to start planting intrigue and throwing compelling characters down your throat, with literally the first real character you meet being one shrouded in uneasy vibes and questionable moral integrity, putting the entire premise sort of off-kilter. But before I get into Esoteric Ebb proper, I do want to briefly tell a tangential but relevant story. After putting down Baldur's Gate 3, after making that video on it roughly 2.5 years ago, I hope that I would one day actually get into RPG games proper. But for now, the best instance of that genre in about a decade had released, and it just didn't click with me. And I was pretty certain about the fact that the genre of RPGs would always be something that I enjoyed in bits and pieces, but would never really be one that I actively engaged with on the same level as my main suite of preferences. But one day, I decided that I would finally sit down and beat a little game I had heard about called Disco Elysium. Now, the way that I saw this game from the outside looking in could only be described as daunting. It was an incredibly dense and esoteric adventure that leaned heavily into political webbings and incredibly nuanced world building, as well as simply being famously weird, subliminal, and outright profound in many of its firm stances, as well as the ones that were played off as laughs. I had tried playing through Disco several times beforehand, but just like many of my former attempts at many RPG video games, the furthest I had been able to get was the end of the first in-game day. I was finding myself in an unwinnable battle of trying to comprehend everything the game was saying, all the way down to the corporate espionage happening above and below the surface, which made me spiral out in a seemingly endless void of connecting dots before finding a desire to hop into a new game, a new experience with all new mechanics, and massage those ridges anew. But this time, I told myself that if something seemed too heady or too dense at the time, I would just absorb what I could and press onward. And it sort of changed everything for me. The simple act of forcing myself to refuse to mindlessly dawdle on my phone while playing something as presumably intimidating as Disco, and secluding myself away from Discord friend calls during my time playing it, not only allowed me to appreciate the RPG as best I could, but I found out that the game wasn't nearly as daunting as I felt like it was from the outset. Upon completing Disco, I felt accomplished. Not just because I finally checked this game off of my never-ending backlog, but because I finally committed to beating something as dense and something requiring as much of your attention as Disco Elysium does. And when I finally finished Disco Elysium and sat there looking at the title screen with a newfound context, I was filled with a profound sense of love for gaming as a whole. It was in those moments where I was talking to people that I knew had finished the game that I had the realization of, maybe RPGs are the best genre that there is. And in a sense, Disco already was my ideal CRPG. It leans very heavily into character archetypes, only technically has some obligatory combat, but none of which is traditional, and is essentially entirely dialogue based. And I think it's here where I say that Disco opened the doors for my love of what RPGs are capable of, but Esoteric Ebb solidified them. And I think that starting off with a slight tangent about Disco is appropriate because Esoteric Ebb does not shy away from where it gets influences on its sleeve. From the basic concept, both visually and narratively alone, it's no secret that this game's biggest influences are both Disco Elysium and Planescape Torment, with both games appearing in the game's credits as a special thank you. What Esoteric Ebb ends up being is essentially a combination of Disco Elysium and Baldur's Gate 3, wherein both games' extensive character reactivity is felt throughout the game world, where many seemingly innocuous things can have both small or dramatic effects on the game narrative, as well as many different opportunities to tackle many, if not all, of the game's set pieces and quests in unique ways. For instance, on my initial playthrough of the game, I refused to swear allegiance to my boss, which made accessing the teach shop, which, don't forget, is the main quest of the game, until the third in-game day. More than half the allotted time given to me. And the only way I was able to finally gain access into it was by using a grace spell on the door and my extensive knowledge of the quest up until that point to lower the DC needed to tear apart the enchanted bits of wood preventing my entrance. On my second character, I literally ripped the planks of wood off the walls on day one and walked in by myself without even coming across the game's main companion, Snell. From the initial character building screen, I was taken aback by the amount of depth of information relayed to the player. From several screens per skill trait conveying how the game's protagonist, the CLERIC, uses each in terms of their relativity to the game's lore, the way that you can use each skill, and the role that each skill plays in the game. Not to mention the many, many different backgrounds that you can choose that offer distinct backstories for the cleric that allow builds to really settle into not only the game's character, but the world right from the onset. What I always loved about Baldur's Gate was the amount of ways that your skills and traits were able to affect the game's dialogue tree systems. While the depth of individual traits or perks inside of a broader skill system found in a game like New Vegas, or even Baldur's Gate 3, is absent from Esoteric Ebb, there isn't much that feels left out in comparison as you actually play through the game. In Ebb, you only have the initial skills that you'll find in D&D, which are Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. Despite only having the 6 options as opposed to the many unique skill systems found in Disco, Esoteric Ebb goes a long way with its self-imposed limitation, but that limitation allows for a lot of free-form creativity within the skills themselves. And just like in Disco, each of these individual skills have their own unique personality and will constantly chime in throughout the game to give their own unique takes on the storyline at hand, the current quest that you're undertaking, or any conversation that you just happen to be having. Strength is all about serving your god and declaring yourself a force to be reckoned with. Dexterity is all about theft, money, and capitalism. Intelligence is all about the self, knowledge, and the world around you, and your superiority to others. Constitution is about self-preservation, timidness, and introversion. Wisdom is about love, community, and the power within the people. And charisma is all about extroversion and a needing to be loved. Each of these personalities come across fantastically and establish themselves as unique storytelling that distinguishes the CLERIC as a unique archetype between different runs of the game, as each background skill check through dialogue will have their own unique dialogue trees that will come about whether or not each skill passes or fails their respective check, leading to potentially hundreds of unique dialogue options that demand multiple playthroughs. And thankfully, the dialogue leads to hundreds of potential skill checks in the game that play out with as much tension as failure as traditional games of D&D, with dice landing on a nat 1 in moments when you need them most. Holy fuck! What? Nat 20s when you couldn't really care less about the task at hand. Oh! And your proficiency saving your ass on a dire skill check. Your build comes into play in nearly every single conversation that you can have in the game, with even more coming into play with side quests, down to even finding some of those side quests in the first place. But none of that matters if the dialogue isn't well written. A game like this lives and dies on its writing, and while Ebb, ironically, doesn't quite reach the incredible esoteric and melancholic highs of its disco dancing counterpart, Esoteric Ebb showcases an incredibly well-written campaign filled with wonderful characters, an amazing goblin companion in the form of Snell, and touches on many relevant topics such as classism, racism, capitalist greed, corruption, the struggle to fight for the working class, actual genocide, and the frugal, confusing nature that is humanity. This is peak fantasy, where its allegories are relevant to today's world, but never feel pandering or too on the nose to take you out of its world. But I feel something particular to note is that the game is, at times, hilarious. While not as occasionally butt-gustingly hysterical as a game like Disco Elysium or the upcoming Clam Man 2, the characters and the cleric himself will clash with each other in rather endearingly funny ways that really make you want to bond with each of them. Connected with healing magic. Don't interrupt me. Despite its consistency with heavy topics like mentioned previously, the game's art style, the world in general, and most importantly, its writing is never drab or dreary, always keeping the mood relatively light and enjoyable the entire time through. And in proper disco fashion, Esoteric Ebb allows you to roleplay as several different types of clerics. You can side with any political factions, be an apolitical nobody, or you can even be as serious or as wacky and irreverent as you want within the guidelines set by the game. My cleric was dead set on the Asgelus party and particularly was obsessed with letting people know that he should be called the Cleric, and loved staring at people in uncomfortable ways that let people potentially let some things slip that they wouldn't likely have otherwise due to the pressure of being stared at. I was steadfast on solving the mystery, but I knew that being a by-the-numbers police officer wasn't the way to go within this game's universe. You can argue that, especially in its attempts at comedy, that Esoteric Ebb is trying a bit too hard to be Disco Elysium, but I don't think that the game's wonderful style, kooky characters, and its inherent nature of being a D&D game feel incongruent with its comedic afflictions, despite the occasional dips into something serious or uncomfortably relevant. Esoteric Ebb actually does a really clever thing where its dialogue is relatively simple at the start of the game. If your intelligence is high, however, you will be rewarded, or bombarded depending on how you look at it, with a plethora of lore dumps in the dialogue that branch out into unique bits and bobs of information that you can look back at whenever you want through the menu. But the main dialogue itself, as well as your internal banter, is rather basic. Each interjection from your 6 characteristics are usually only a sentence or two, and the people that you talk to at first only mutter a few sentences at a time before giving you a unique dialogue option to choose from. But by the second or third day of your campaign, the dialogue opens up dramatically and becomes a rather demanding series of information dumps, heavy lore drops, and at times very wordy and heavy dialogue that is witty, funny, as well as equally thought-provoking with its themes. Esoteric Ebb pulls a magic trick in front of your own eyes and you don't even realize it's happening until it's too late. You will find characters that are either inconsequential or side quest characters, and their dialogue trees go on for upwards of 35 to 40 minutes at a time. This character that I'm showing now, I spoke to for about an hour straight, and I did not get a single repeating bit of dialogue. The dialogue trees just keep going on and on and on, and it's all so well written. This conversation in particular was the moment that I realized that this game's writing was something special. Esoteric Ebb is all of these things, but without the frankly awkwardly shoved in combat of D&D. I don't mind failing in an RPG. I love living with my decisions in a game like this. I hardly ever save scum, and like 9 times out of 10, maybe like 99 out of 100, I will accept all that has befallen on me in an RPG. Games like this especially are all about failing forward, which is why I think Disco works so well, because while you technically could die, the amount of opportunities to die were relatively minimal, and everything around the game was essentially a look and see what happens sort of thing. When you throw combat in the mix of a game like D&D, or Disco Elysium, or Esoteric Ebb, that fun of look and see what happens suddenly stops, and now it's a game of don't fail, otherwise it's game over. And I think that Esoteric Ebb iterates on the idea of a combatless CRPG from Disco pretty much flawlessly, albeit taking many, many notes from the pages of that behemoth of the genre that came before it. While there are many more segments of what could be considered combat in the game, where you have to roll initiative and engage with an enemy in the hopes of killing it before it kills you, even combat is essentially whittled down to just dialogue, at least mechanically. All of your stats will come into play as skill checks that are various ways that you could take down the opponent, from either charisma checking some enemies into surrendering, or punching the living daylights out of them and standing over their broken body as a man's man. But as an RPG game, you do have quests and side quests to accomplish. In a neat little twist of visual design, you can see every single quest in the game right from the start. Well, at least the amount of those quests. By exploring and talking to characters in the world, you'll uncover them in your visual quest log bit by bit, but slowly start to trace a path between many of them. Esoteric Ebb's quests also unlock a potential suite of perks in this game's version of the Thought Cabinet from Disco Elysium.
Whereas in Disco, you have a somewhat annoying sequence of discovering the thought, deciding whether or not to commit to it, and then just sort of letting it stew in your mind while you go about doing other things, and then eventually, after some allocated time, the thought eventually clicks, letting you get the perk and the full committed thought. But in Esoteric Ebb, there is a fantastic iteration on this, where upon completing specific quests, you'll have the option of committing to a thought, just like in Disco, but this time around, it is yet another huge dialogue tree. But it's fully introspective, where you talk with yourself, where your traits essentially make an argument for why you should listen to them and their version of the perk over the other. And these dialogues range from rather funny and mundane to some really well-written existential examinations of not only who you want your cleric to be, but some relative discussions of real-world concepts. And at the end of it all, you will decide between 2 or more distinct perks that will apply to your cleric, based on the arguments made by those inner monologues. On top of that, the perk is basically an instant acquisition, as opposed to the retrospectively awkward waiting period of Disco's Thought Cabinet. Even in this aspect, the game is fun, incredibly well written, and exactly what I want from this subgenre here onward. My time spent with Esoteric Ebb was relatively brief, with the main campaign only taking roughly 27 hours or so, and I didn't even get around to all the side quests, but I got a good chunk of them completed, and I don't regret a single moment I spent in this game's world. By the time that I solved the mystery of the exploding tea shop and finally cast my ballot in the election, I had that special feeling that you only get with certain types of media, where you feel the end coming and you wish you could spend just a bit longer in its world, uncover more of its secrets, discover more of its characters, and spend more time with those characters. Esoteric Ebb is not only a great game, but it's the first game that I would say that has been released that is genuinely worth your time in the realm of this burgeoning disco-like genre. It has even been praised by Argo Tulik from Disco's original development team, and I think that its impact on the future of this subgenre cannot be overstated. Esoteric Ebb is a game that, frankly, I didn't even think could exist. To take something as perpetual as D&D and reinvent it to essentially remove half of its entire rule set was something that I wanted from a mod for Baldur's Gate 3 for years at this point, but sort of delegated that to just a dream. And it's a dream that the game's director Christopher must have had for several years themselves, as Esoteric Ebb is something that they've been working on for the better part of a decade. Games like this are the reason the art form as a whole deserves your time. These small projects that are born out of a place of a burning passion, a fire inside that refuses to die. AAA games may gather a lot of hype, and games like this tend to fly under a lot of people's radars, but there are no AAA games where you feel the passion as hard as a game like Esoteric Ebb. It made a dream of mine come true. The game itself is a dream come true for the developer, and a game this complex, this well written, and this well developed coming out at all is nothing short of a miracle.
The CLERIC.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.
You tried your best, but yeah, it's time to stop. But maybe try one more time. Indeed, maybe. It's risky, but if you try really hard...
Oh, shit?
Pet the bird. No!